The blood oath changed everything the moment it was introduced into American organized crime in the early 20th century, transforming loose criminal confederations into a disciplined, hierarchical army bound by ritual and enforced loyalty. In October 1963, a low-level soldier named Joseph Valachi sat before a televised Senate subcommittee and became the first made member to publicly describe the initiation ceremony in detail, shattering the code of omerta that had protected La Cosa Nostra for generations. What drove men to undergo this ritual, and why did a symbolic ceremony hold such terrifying power over hardened criminals for nearly a century? The answer lies not in mythology, but in organizational necessity. By the late 1920s, Italian-American criminal networks faced an existential problem. Prohibition had created unprecedented opportunities for profit, but rapid expansion brought infiltrators, informants, and opportunists who threatened the entire enterprise. The old way of doing business, relying on village ties and blood relations imported from Sicily, could not scale to meet the demands of a national bootlegging operation worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Trust needed to be manufactured, and fear needed a formal architecture. The initiation ceremony became that architecture, a psychological contract enforced by the threat of death and the promise of brotherhood. The ritual itself arrived in America with Sicilian immigrants who carried the traditions of the Mafia from Palermo and Corleone, but it was formalized and standardized by American mob leaders who recognized its utility. In the years following the Castellamarese War of 1930 and 1931, which ended with the assassination of Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranziano, and the rise of the Commission, the 5 New York families codified their structures. Charles Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and the other architects of modern American organized crime understood that ceremony created commitment. A man who underwent a blood oath in a locked room surrounded by made members had crossed a threshold he could never uncross, and that psychological barrier was worth more than any legal contract. If you're watching because you want to understand how criminal organizations actually functioned, how they built loyalty systems more durable than most legitimate corporations, then subscribe now, because this channel exists to dissect the mechanics of power, secrecy, and control that shape the underworld. The process of becoming a made man began long before the ceremony itself. Candidates were observed for years, sometimes decades, performing tasks that demonstrated both competence and submission. They had to be of full Italian descent, a rule enforced with genealogical scrutiny that would be remarkable in any context. This ethnic restriction was not merely prejudice, but operational security, rooted in the belief that shared heritage created deeper, less penetrable bonds, and that outsiders, no matter how loyal they appeared, could never fully internalize the codes that governed mob life. Associates who were Irish, Jewish, or otherwise ethnically ineligible could earn fortunes and wield significant power. Men like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel operated at the highest levels, but they could never be formally inducted, never receive the protection and status that came with being made. A prospective member had to be proposed by an existing made man, typically someone who had worked closely with the candidate and could vouch for his reliability. This sponsor assumed enormous personal risk. If the proposed member later turned informant or violated the family's rules, the sponsor could face severe punishment, including death. This system created a web of mutual accountability. Every made member had a vested interest in the conduct of those he vouched for, and every new initiate knew that his actions could destroy the man who elevated him. The proposal was then reviewed by the family's leadership, the boss, underboss, and consigliere, who investigated the candidate's background, criminal history, and personal life. Any hint of disloyalty, any contact with law enforcement, any weakness that could be exploited, and the proposal was rejected without explanation. The candidate also had to have killed, or at least participated directly in a murder sanctioned by the family. This requirement was not universal across all families or all eras, and some members were inducted based on exceptional earning ability or strategic value. But the expectation of blood on one's hands served multiple purposes. It demonstrated a willingness to commit the ultimate crime on behalf of the organization, a willingness that separated the ambitious from the truly committed. It also ensured complicity. A man who had killed for the family could never credibly cooperate with authorities without implicating himself in a capital offense, a legal and psychological barrier that made betrayal far less likely. The murder requirement bound the initiate to the organization through shared guilt, a form of collateral that could never be reclaimed. Once approved, the candidate was summoned to the ceremony without advance notice. He would be told only to come to a specific location at a specific time, often a private home, a social club, or the back room of a restaurant. He was not told why. This lack of forewarning served a purpose. It prevented the candidate from preparing a defense if the meeting was actually a setup, a lure to kill him for some unknown offense. It also meant he arrived in a state of heightened anxiety and uncertainty, psychologically primed for the transformation that was about to occur. When Joseph Valachi described his own initiation in 1930, he recalled being driven to a house in the Bronx, led into a room, and finding himself surrounded by 30 or 40 men, all silent, all watching him. He did not know if he was about to be honored or executed. The room was arranged with intention. A long table, often covered with a white cloth, an image of a saint, sometimes a small statue or a holy card positioned prominently, a gun and a knife placed on the table. These objects were not decorative. Each carried symbolic weight and communicated the dual nature of the organization, sacred and profane, spiritual and violent. The boss presided over the ceremony, flanked by senior members. The candidate stood before them and the questions began. He was asked if he knew why he was there. He was asked if he understood the seriousness of the step he was about to take. He was told that once he entered this life, there was no exit except through death. Some accounts describe the boss pricking the candidate's trigger finger with a pin or the tip of a knife, drawing blood, which was then smeared onto the image of the saint. The saint card was set aflame and placed in the candidate's cupped hands, and he was instructed to repeat an oath while the paper burned. The exact wording of the oath varied, but the core elements remained consistent across families and decades. The initiate swore loyalty to the family above all else, above his own blood relatives, above the law, above any competing allegiance. He vowed to never betray the secrets of the organization, to never cooperate with authorities, and to never engage in romantic relationships with the wives or girlfriends of other members. A rule designed to prevent internal conflict and maintain cohesion. He promised to come when called, to kill when ordered, and to accept punishment, including death, if he violated these rules. As the burning card turned to ash in his hands, he was told that if he betrayed his oath, he would burn like the saint, his soul destroyed as utterly as the paper. The physical pain of holding the flame, minor but real, reinforced the gravity of the moment. After the oath, the new member was introduced to the others in the room, often with a phrase indicating his new status. He was now a friend of ours, a made man, a member of La Cosa Nostra, this thing of ours. He learned the structure of the family, the names of the boss and other leaders, and the protocols that govern daily life. He was taught the formal greeting, a kiss on both cheeks, and the proper way to address superiors. He was told that from this moment forward, he could never raise his hand against another made member without permission from the boss. A rule that created internal order, but also left members vulnerable to abuse and exploitation by those above them in the hierarchy. He learned that disputes between made men had to be mediated by leadership, not settled personally, and that unsanctioned violence within the family was punishable by death. The ceremony was remarkably consistent across the 5 New York families. The Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese organizations, as well as families in other cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, and New Orleans. This uniformity was not accidental. After the establishment of the Commission in 1931, the ruling body of American organized crime, standards were harmonized to facilitate cooperation and prevent misunderstandings between families. A made man from one family could be recognized and respected by members of another, and the rules governing interfamily relations were understood by all. This standardization turned a collection of regional gangs into a national network, a criminal corporation with shared governance and mutual obligations. But the ceremony was more than theater. It created a psychological transformation that former members and law enforcement officials consistently described as profound. A man who had been an associate, someone who worked with the mob but remained outside its formal structure, suddenly gained access to opportunities and protections previously unavailable. He could now earn a percentage from rackets controlled by the family, participate in high-level meetings, and invoke the family's name to settle disputes or collect debts. He was no longer alone. The flip side was equally significant. He was now subject to absolute authority. A made member could be ordered to commit murder, to surrender profitable rackets, to go to prison without complaint, and refusal meant death. The ceremony did not grant freedom, It granted membership in a totalitarian system that demanded everything and offered protection only as long as obedience continued. The power of the ritual derived from its irreversibility. Unlike a business partnership or even a marriage, there was no formal mechanism for leaving. The phrase blood in, blood out captured this reality. You entered through a blood oath, and you exited through your own blood. There were cases of members who tried to retire, to fade quietly into civilian life, but the organization's memory was long, and its paranoia deep. Even decades after initiation, a former member remained subject to recall, to orders, to the threat of violence if his loyalty was questioned. This permanence created a kind of ontological shift. The initiate ceased to be merely a criminal and became something else, a member of a secret society with its own laws, its own courts, and its own executioners. Joseph Valachi's testimony in 1963 was a seismic event precisely because it made the invisible visible. For the first time, the American public heard a detailed description of the initiation ceremony from someone who had experienced it. Valachi was not a high-ranking member. He was a soldier, a low-level participant in the Genovese family, but his willingness to testify shattered the illusion of omerta as an unbreakable code. He described the burning saint card, the blood oath, the warnings about betrayal. He named names, drew organizational charts, and explained the commission. His testimony was broadcast on television and covered extensively in the press, transforming the Mafia from an ethnic slur or a tabloid rumor into a documented, structured criminal enterprise with specific rituals and rules. Valachi's decision to cooperate was itself a product of the system he described. In 1962, while serving time in federal prison, Valachi became convinced that his boss, Vito Genovese, had marked him for death, suspecting him of being an informant. In a panic, Valachi killed another inmate he mistakenly believed had been sent to murder him. Facing a murder charge and certain execution if returned to the general prison population, Valachi made a calculated choice. He would cooperate with federal authorities, not out of moral awakening, but out of survival. The very system that had once promised him protection had turned against him, and the only escape was to break the oath he had sworn 3 decades earlier. The FBI and the Bureau of Narcotics had long suspected the existence of a national organized crime network, but they lacked concrete proof and insider testimony. Valachi provided both. His account corroborated years of surveillance, wiretaps, and intelligence gathered by agents like Joseph Pistone, who would later infiltrate the Bonanno family as Donnie Brasco, and confirmed the theories of organized crime investigators who had argued that the Mafia was not a loose collection of gangs, but a disciplined hierarchical organization. Valachi's testimony gave law enforcement a roadmap, a way to understand and ultimately dismantle the structure he described. The initiation ceremony was not just a relic of Sicilian tradition, but a constantly evolving tool of organizational control. In the decades following Valachi's testimony, as federal prosecutions intensified and RICO statutes allowed for the indictment of entire criminal enterprises, the families adapted. Ceremonies became less frequent and more secretive. Some families suspended initiations entirely for years, fearing infiltration. The Bonanno family, deeply compromised by the undercover work of Joseph Pistone in the late 1970s, reportedly halted inductions for nearly 2 decades. When ceremonies did occur, they were smaller, held in remote locations, and involved fewer witnesses. The ritual remained, but the context had changed. The ceremony that once symbolized strength and unity now carried the risk of surveillance and prosecution. Despite these adaptations, the initiation process retained its psychological power. Even in the 1980s and 1990s, as the golden age of the American Mafia faded under relentless federal pressure, men still sought to be made. The status, the earning potential, and the identity that came with membership remained attractive, even as the risks multiplied. Wiretaps from the 1990s captured mobsters discussing upcoming ceremonies with a mixture of excitement and anxiety, aware that the FBI was listening, but unable to resist the allure of formal recognition. In one recorded conversation, a Gambino family member described the initiation as the greatest day of his life, a sentiment that revealed how deeply the ritual had embedded itself in the culture of organized crime. The ceremony also served as a filter, a way to control the size and quality of the organization, by limiting membership to those who had proven themselves over years of service, who had killed or demonstrated exceptional value, and who were vouched for by trusted members. The families maintained a degree of operational security even as external pressure mounted. The exclusivity of MAID membership created a class system within the criminal underworld. Associates, no matter how wealthy or influential, remained subordinate to made men, and this hierarchy was enforced with violence when necessary. The initiation ceremony was the gate, and controlling access to that gate was a strategic priority. The long-term impact of the initiation ritual extended far beyond the individuals who underwent it. The ceremony created a template for loyalty and control that other criminal organizations studied and sometimes imitated. Outlaw motorcycle gangs, prison gangs, and transnational criminal networks all developed their own initiation rites, recognizing that formal ceremonies, shared secrets, and blood oaths could bind members together in ways that money alone could not. The Mafia's model demonstrated that organized crime could function as a kind of alternative government, with its own laws, its own rituals, and its own systems of reward and punishment, and that model influenced criminal enterprises around the world. By the early 21st century, the American Mafia had been devastated by decades of prosecutions, defections, and generational attrition. The initiation ceremony, once a closely guarded secret, had been described in courtrooms, documentaries, and even Hollywood films. The mystique had evaporated, replaced by a detailed public record of names, dates, and procedures, yet the ritual persisted in diminished form. Small ceremonies still occurred, sometimes with only a handful of participants, as aging bosses tried to preserve traditions that had defined their lives. These ceremonies were shadows of what they once were, held in the knowledge that the Golden Age had ended, and that the organization they served was a fraction of its former self. The initiation process of the Mafia reveals a fundamental truth about human organizations. Loyalty is not a natural state, but a manufactured one, built through ritual, reinforced by fear, and sustained by the promise of belonging. The blood oath worked not because it was ancient or exotic, but because it created irreversible commitment, binding individuals to a collective identity that transcended self-interest. The ceremony transformed criminals into members, replacing individual autonomy with collective obligation. And that transformation allowed the American Mafia to function as a disciplined, enduring enterprise for most of the 20th century. The ritual's power lay not in its symbolism, but in its consequences, the real and immediate costs of betrayal, and the tangible benefits of membership, a calculus that kept men loyal even when logic suggested they should flee. Understanding that calculus, the mechanics of manufactured loyalty, offers insight not just into organized crime, but into any system that demands absolute allegiance and punishes deviation with irrevocable finality.